Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University, and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. This is our last podcast of the year, and we decided to turn the tables and ask André Pagliarini, who is a member of the editorial team that produces the Washington, Brazil office's weekly newsletter, to join us and conduct an interview with me about the work of the Washington, Brazil office and the current situation in Brazil. André is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Hampden-Sydney College, who specializes in 20th century Brazilian history. André, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you for having me, Jim, to talk with you at the end of the year here as we look forward to what's going to be a really important 2024. I'm really pleased you asked me to have this conversation to close out the year with you. So should we dive right in?
Sure.
So 2024, both for the United States and Brazil, is going to be a really important year, which maybe we can get to at the end. But I think we should begin by looking back on the year that was. 2023, of course, began with Lula's inauguration on January 1st. It was a really, I think, auspicious moment. Symbolically, Lula went up the ramp to the presidential palace with different representatives of a diverse society that Brazil is. And then, of course, not too much, not too long after that, we're coming up on the year anniversary. In fact, there is this insurrection of Bolsonarista supporters and this kind of attack on Brazilian institutions that cast a pall over at least the first few days and weeks and months of the Lula administration. I wonder if to begin with, you can talk to us about that moment, what it's meant this year, how the international community responded to it, your thoughts on that as we approach the year anniversary of January 6th.
So let me back up a little bit to talk about what happened in 22, because I think this is really essential to understanding the way that the Washington, Brazil office and democratic forces within Brazil and outside of Brazil responded. We analyzed at the WBO that 22 would be a crucial year for Brazilian history, that the indications were that Bolsonaro was not going to play fairly, that he was already planting the seeds of the possibility of electoral fraud by challenging the legitimacy of the electronic voting booths, the electronic machines that have been used in Brazil very successfully since 1996. And so because of the experiences we had had in the United States with Trump denying the election results of the 2020 election, we really anticipated something similar happening in Brazil, and we were right. And so one of the major things that we did over many activities over the course of 22 was to organize a delegation of 20 members, representatives of civil society and human rights organizations and think tanks to go to Washington, D.C., to speak with Congress, representatives from the White House, from the State Department, from the Organization of American States, to really spread the word about the fear that Brazilian citizens were having about the possibility of either the election results not being recognized or the military intervening to impose Bolsonaro should he lose the elections. And it was a very successful week, and it really raised the consciousness among congressional representatives and senators. They spoke out in a letter denouncing the potential threat to democracy in Brazil. And all of this was happening concurrently with what I consider to be a very correct position of the Biden administration to send multiple signals to the armed forces in Brazil that should they consider carrying out some kind of military intervention to overturn the election results, that the United States would oppose it. They would not only not support it, that they would really clearly oppose it. And this was a message that the White House sent, the State Department sent it. It was very clearly signaled to the armed forces in Brazil. Joined along with that, the pressure in Congress to say the same message. And I think the height of that was just before the first round of the elections. Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia presented a unanimous consent resolution in the Senate that was approved by the entire body. No one objected, and if any senator objected to the decision to pass this resolution, it would not have passed. And it sent a very strong and clear message to the military. Lula ran in the elections in the second round. He won by 2 million votes. It was a very close election, but he won, even though there was some hanky-pankies by the government trying to interfere in the results. And after that, as you pointed out, very successful and very emotional inauguration. And then a week later, Bolsonaro's forces tried to kind of intervene and overturn the situation and provoke basically a military intervention. And they had done this since the election results were announced at the end of October. They were really mobilizing, camping out in front of army barracks to pressure the military to intervene. And they invaded the 3 seats of power. They destroyed property. They caused tremendous damage, but they were not successful. And they were largely not successful because the armed forces were divided. We currently know that, in fact, the Air Force was enthusiastic about a plan that was being circulated among Bolsonaro's supporters with the support of Bolsonaro, but the Navy and the armed forces, understanding that they did not have U.S. government support, if they were to carry out an attempted coup and it failed, it would really discredit entirely the military. So they backed down and they decided not to support what was demanded by Bolsonaro supporters. And I think this was a tremendously important victory for democracy in Brazil. And if we take into consideration that the United States had supported the 1964 military coup and had supported the dictatorship in power, this clear message by the Biden administration in favor of democracy, I think, was a crucial element among many in deterring what would have been a horrific military takeover.
No, absolutely. I wanted to begin there because it's one of these instances, as you pointed out, where what might have been a really deep crisis was for the most part contained and averted. And, the WBO played its role as one of many international, agents drawing attention to this. But I want to zoom out from that specific case to talk about the WBO and its mission. So what can you tell us what does success look like for the WBO? In this case, clearly, it was helping to contain this anti-democratic insurgency or insurrection and get the institutions to kind of calm down, international attention, all of that. But more broadly, aside from that specific case, what does the WBO consider to be success for its mission? What does that look like?
Yeah. So again, in this story, and I'd like to go back and understand the context of things. There's actually been solidarity with Brazil starting in 1969 when Congressman Marcio Moreira Alves, who had been punished by the Congress for speaking out against the military dictatorship, and the government tried to take a seat away in Congress, and the Congress voted against that. And then the government used this as a pretext to clamp down and issue a decree, Institutional Act Number 5, which really shut down the democracy in the country totally. And so he is going to the United States in 1969 and talking to senators about the situation in Brazil, returning in 1970 to speak at the Latin American Studies Association, began a process of years of activities by Brazilians in conjunction with people in the United States to defend democracy in Brazil. At first by denouncing the dictatorship and its authoritarian measures, and then later supporting efforts to expand democracy as the country moved from authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. So that's the context of many years of work. And in 2018, when Brazilian scholars of Brazil in the United States, and Brazilians living in the United States came together at the Columbia University Law School to found the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. And at that meeting, we presented a resolution calling on the establishment of an office in Washington, D.C. that focused on Brazil. Now, there are many other people working on Latin America in Washington, D.C., but there had never been a concerted effort to combine think tank activities, developing policies and writing about the reality of Brazil with an articulation in Congress. So in 2019, we were able to raise money to be able to hire our first executive director, Juliana Moraes, who helped us launch the WBO as an entity. She had already been working in DC and supporting efforts in Congress to educate representatives about the situation in Brazil. Very, very important work she and others had done prior to the establishment of the WBO. But we were able, with her work, to start developing more intense relations with people in Congress, which led to all the articulations that I outlined with you. So what are our goals? Our goals are really actually to be a space in DC and in the United States where people can come together to think about Brazil from a progressive perspective and to suggest good policy for the United States vis-a-vis Brazil. And at the same time, to support social movements, NGOs, think tanks in Brazil, which wish to articulate internationally their concerns about Brazil in the United States and other parts of the world, trying to explain to people what would be the best practices of the US government and the European Union, and also what would be the best ways for Brazilian social movements to be able to raise their questions, raise their voices internationally. And so we've become a vehicle for that over the course of the 4 years that we've been kind of in existence, and the last 2 years when we institutionalized. And we're able to reorganize and hire Paulo and Piauí, a lawyer, a professor of law who worked with the Ministry of Justice and later was the executive secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights as our new executive director, expanding our team to really successfully work in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Brasilia, and in Rio de Janeiro. And that's kind of been our mission, is to successfully expand our work to be able to provide opportunities for social movements in Brazil to articulate their demands, their concerns, their issues in the United States and beyond.
I think one of the things WBO can be proud of is the extent to which, while it's still a small organization, the impact that it's had this year, in which so much international attention has been focused on Brazil, has been, I think, noticeable and tangible. So thinking about that, I guess a two-part question. What is your feeling personally as Jim Green about the year ahead, 2024, for Brazil, for South America, for the United States, but then also for the WBO? What are the plans for the year ahead? And how are you sort of feeling about the year that's taking shape before us?
So I think, for Brazil, the year has been a tremendous challenge because the Bolsonaro government destroyed so many aspects of progressive social programs and activities in the country. And so part of this year has been rebuilding Brazil and reconstituting commissions, entities, programs, policies that have been abandoned by the Bolsonaro administration. And I think that that also includes trying to find a way to stabilize the economy, to decrease inflation, to really find ways to be able to financially viably implement many of the social programs that had been abandoned by or reduced by the Bolsonaro administration. And so I think that's the challenge of the Lula administration in Brazil, and they're working very hard at that. In terms of our work and our plans ahead, this last year, we really started prioritizing our areas of action. The first and the most important one that we initiated was working on racial equality and social justice in Brazil, working with a group of 15 Black social movement organizations in Brazil to help them determine their own agenda for what they wanted to articulate internationally, and becoming their technical advisors on how to carry that out, whether that's within the framework of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, or the Organization of American States, or in the US Congress, or at the United Nations, or even as we're expanding our work to Europe, building alliances there to be able to articulate these questions in Europe. So that's been a very important first work. It was a high priority of us to confront racism and racial inequality in Brazil and really support the social movements that are trying to change a long-term hierarchical society that really keeps Afro-Brazilians and indigenous peoples and other communities at the social lower end of the social pyramid. So that's been really important. Our second area and a priority of ours, and this is an international priority as well, is the question of the environment and working with COP30, G20, and all the other bodies that are going to be raising the questions of the environment in the coming period of time. So we're working with organizations to find the effective ways to have a clear, concerted, coordinated international articulation around issues related to the environment. We've also been working closely with some of the human rights organizations that are very concerned about memory and history and the legacy of the dictatorship and the necessity to guarantee that the long-term results of the authoritarian rule in Brazil, the ways in which the military controlled the nation are addressed. And in this regard, we've initiated a campaign. We've written, these organizations in Brazil, with the support of the WBO, have have generated a letter to the Biden White House asking them to declassify and open up to the public all of the documents in the U.S. government archives related to Brazil during the military regime. While it's normal practice for the U.S. government to declassify documents, we've identified at least 1,000 documents and several important hearings that took place in which the material has not been released to the public, and we're going to call on we've called on the Biden administration to consider declassifying this documentation. And because next year, 24, is the 60th anniversary of the military coup d'etat of 1964, and because it's the 200th anniversary of the U.S. recognition of independent Brazil in 1824, we're hoping that the U.S. government will realize this is a marvelous gesture of goodwill between the two countries to make this material available to the public. And finally, another area that we've been working on very hard has been on artistic freedom and expression, the ways in which the previous government had carried out a series of campaigns of censorship and of repression of artistic expression in the country. And we're working to articulate an international agenda to guarantee artistic expression, freedom of expression in Brazil and in Latin America as a whole. And so that's another campaign that we're working on. We have 7 areas of work, and we're working slowly to build so that we can expand to cover all those 7 areas. But as you said, we're a small organization, and we have to do it step by step.
Related to the question of documents and historical anniversaries, I would note, right, that another thing that happened this year was this trip of a handful of progressive members of Congress who went to Latin America, went to Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. And one of the things that they asked for in Chile was precisely what you just said, a release of documents that remain classified, that many Chilean scholars and activists and members of government have been asking for. And the Biden administration, I'm not sure these things it was connected to the trip per se, but given this pressure on the, near the anniversary of the Chilean coup, which was, marking the anniversary this year, the 40th, released documents. So maybe there's some precedent there for next year in the 64 anniversary for more documents to follow. Of course, that depends on a relatively receptive U.S. partner or chief executive. I wonder how you're thinking about the 2024 election. I mean, clearly, so much of the WBO's work relies on working with Democrats in Congress, although perhaps not exclusively. But do you see the scenario changing drastically, say, if Joe Biden is not reelected? How does that change what the WBO can think of doing, can hope to do? Or is it that the WBO is working at a congressional level that is not as impacted at the national level? I mean, how does that shape the work?
No, I think, 24 is a crucial year for everyone. I think that anyone who understands it differently is really putting their head in the sands. And the outcome of the American elections is going to change the profile of the world. If Trump is reelected, it's going to mark a very, very bad period ahead. He's already announced his intentions to really move towards an authoritarian rule in the country and to repress his opposition and to shut down media outlets and get revenge on all the people who opposed him. So if he is elected, the country is really going to face, the U.S. is going to really face a serious period, and as will the world. And so this is going to be a crucial question. I think, if in the horrible outcome, Biden is defeated and Trump is elected, it will just mean we're going to have to step up our efforts, working with our allies in Congress, working with other allies and supporters to really continue to push for a progressive agenda. But it's going to be much harder. And I, quite frankly, I'm not looking forward to the thought of living for 4 years under Donald Trump. It'll really be a nightmare as far as I'm concerned if that happens. But we'll see. I mean, I think we're prepared for that outcome as a possibility. We'll have to really reinforce our work to be able to successfully work under the conditions of a very hostile national government. And I think Congress will become therefore a very crucial area of resistance to the regime.
As you said in the beginning, it really, I think, mattered that Biden was president during the election in Brazil last year, right? Because it's one of those sort of hinge moments. Things might have gone very differently if a Trump Secretary of Defense was in power, or Trump CIA appointee, was in power. That really could have been important.
Absolutely.
still thinking about these big questions. One of the things that I've always admired about you is the way you combine a real scholarly legacy, really important works related to all these questions that we've been discussing, with an activist's passion and fire and tirelessness. I'd like to hear you talk about how you see your position at this stage in your career in Brazil, in the United States. How do you hope people see you in both places? How do you hope to contribute, I suppose, academically, but beyond as well?
So, because I have a kind of an unusual history towards related to Brazil, because I lived in Brazil for 6 years before going back to graduate school and studying, and I lived intensely the period of the dictatorship as a leader in the left wing of the gay movement and as an opponent of the military regime as I studied at the University of São Paulo, very involved in all the activities against the dictatorship. I was very aware of the unequal relations of power between the United States and Brazil, where not only in a geopolitical sense, the United States dominated and had tremendous influence over the country, which provoked tremendous resentment to U.S. hegemony in the region, but also the way in which information flows go from the north to the south and very rarely go from the south to the north, which is why most Americans know nothing about Brazil. And in fact, in reflecting on this recently, I realized I only had one class in the 7th grade in my geography class about Brasilia. And that was the only thing I ever learned about Brazil in the entire period of my life before I did graduate work at the Cal State University, Long Beach, Los Angeles, and then at UCLA. So in fact, I've always been concerned about shifting to the extent possible this relationship of power between the United States and Brazil, which could indirectly be reflected in the way in which North Americans who worked on Brazil came to Brazil and studied Brazil. Although I think the overwhelming majority of people who work on Brazil are very sensitive to the people and the culture and the society, there's still an embedded unequal relation of power. And so my goal has always been to revert that, or to at least question it, be conscious of it, and find ways to subvert it. And that had to do with the ways in which, as a member of the executive of the Brazilian Studies Association, and then as vice president and president, and then years later as the executive director, I really thought to rethink that organization in a way that would create balance of power and relations of equity between Brazilians and scholars of Brazil working on Brazil in the United States, in alliance with scholars working on Brazil in Brazil. And so that's one part of it, which is really basically in professional organizations building a different relationship to the country. And then as the political situation worsened, as Dilma Rousseff was threatened with a parliamentary coup, which was carried out, as the country moved very sharply to the right, it became clear to me that a tradition which was very deeply embedded in Brazilian academia and in most professional organizations of the United States, which had not been the practice of Brasa, was required that we think about how we could appropriately, as professionals, speak out about academic freedom, the lack of rights of professors and university students in the era of Bolsonaro. And so the Brazilian Studies Association, starting in 2026, cautiously took positions questioning the lack of democracy in Brazil, the need to defend academic freedom and academics doing scholarly work there, and really taking a stand. And although there was a small resistance by a few Brazilians and a few US scholars who questioned whether we should take that turn, I think the overwhelming majority of the members of the association agreed to do that and did it enthusiastically. And so that concern broadened in the response beyond Brazilian Studies Association to the situation as Temer took power and then as Bolsonaro took power. And I think we can say that 95% of the scholars working on Brazil in the United States, whether they're people born as US citizens born there or scholars of Brazil who have moved and have built their career in the United States, that we really have become engaged in really thinking of ways as scholars we can be defenders of democracy in social justice in the country. And I think we've effectively done that, and the way in which so many scholars have joined the Washington Brazil office in giving contributions or to participate as research scholars, as you are, or writing for our weekly bulletin, or being a member of our board of directors, all have been very, very important in recreating relations between the two countries in very positive ways in my vision. And that is also parallel to the work that I've chose to do over the years as a scholar, thinking about academic work that's not being produced in Brazil that I might have a privileged opportunity to work on, my work on homosexuality in Brazil, my work on the history of the opposition to the dictatorship, and other areas of research, which I think contribute because there's been a certain absence of that research, that work in Brazil that I was able to produce and to disseminate. And it's always been very important that my audience is primarily Brazilian, because I think that the work we do as Brazilianists should be very much in dialogue with the way our work is received in Brazil. And I'm very happy that practically everything I've written has been translated and published in Portuguese. So what my legacy is, I don't know. I mean, that's up to history to decide to what extent I'll have a lasting influence. Even though I will be retiring from Brown University next year, I'm not giving up my political activities with the Washington Brazil office, and I have 5 book projects in the make. So we'll see how many of those actually get done over the next 2 decades.
Speaking of your activities in academia in Brazil and the United States, have you ever felt, and I ask this because WBO, a little bit of this, with this idea of an American, a US citizen working on Brazil. I know you have extensive, decades-long relationships and deep friendships. I've seen it as your graduate student when you've been kind enough to take me in tow to some of these meetings, and I meet people and I say, oh, Jim, they know Jim very well. But have you ever felt a kind of, this is a North American or this is an American writing about these issues? Because it's not specific to you, right? Sometimes, as you mentioned earlier, this history of an unequal sort of power distribution between northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. How has that influenced or shaped your own work, or maybe it hasn't really?
So, I mean, I think the first had to do with a unique experience I had being in Brazil from August 76 to December 81, in which I was a founding member of the first gay rights organization in the country, Group Somos, and was very important in building the left wing of that organization. There were some people who didn't agree with my politics and disagree with my vision, but I really built a lot of legitimacy by being on the ground, active and participatory. I also was connected to the left, and one would assume that people would have been afraid of me, thinking that I might have been a member of the CIA. And it's very interesting because I've talked to a lot of people over the years. Said, did you ever distrust me or think I was in the CIA? And they said, you were so different and unique and open and honest that it didn't even occur to us that could possibly be the situation. Now, more recently, there have been a small sector of the left that is very distrustful of the United States for many good reasons, and wonder what is the really intent of the WBO. Who funds us? How are we doing our work? Who makes our decisions? And we're an organization, although in the United States, very clearly wanted to include and make as a principal part of our work Brazilians. And so of our core team, the vast majority are Brazilians working with us. And we were very conscious of wanting to make sure that our movement was supported by social movements in Brazil and NGOs and think tanks. And so the 55 plus organizations who have affiliated with the WBO are the cream of the crop of social movements in Brazil, from the Landless Peasants movement, the MST, to the housing movement in Sao Paulo, to the most important human rights organizations, Marielle Franco Institute, the Vladimir Herzog Institute, the Arns Commission. We have a vast number of Black organizations, environmental organizations supporting our work. And so there are some people who say, well, something may be bad happening here. But the question then is, is it not possible for social movements in Brazil to figure out who are their allies and who are not, and make their decisions to join with us? And they have, and we've had really good results with that. So I think it is very true that the United States has done many very problematic things in Brazil and Latin America and around the world over the course of time. And so to counter that, we have to really have a very clear, transparent policy mechanism for functioning and democratic processes, et cetera, to counterbalance any fears that people might have or any reservations. And we've been very successful in that regard. And I think it also has to do with the fact that I was very consciously wanting to build these very close relations with people in Brazil over the course of time. It's really funny, Andre, because in the United States, I can say I don't really know anyone of importance at all. I mean, I've met now some Congress people, some senators, I know one actor who got kind of famous. I don't know really anyone, and I'm in a university, a very prestigious university, teaching
Right.
Brazilian history. In Brazil, I literally know 10 ministers of the current government who would know me by first name. I know 3 past presidents. So it's a very strange situation. To a certain extent, it's partially built upon a certain deference, cultural deference that
Right.
Brazilians have to North Americans, and I'm conscious of that, and I don't try to play with that or take advantage of that, but I know that that's a dynamic in the relationships I have with people, and consciously I'm trying to be on the side of democracy and social justice, which was the original reason I got involved in working on Brazil, in 1973, and a small study group in Philadelphia when I started learning about the country, its people, its culture, its history.
That's the thing, Jim. As we begin to wind things down, I was looking this up before we spoke. Median age in Brazil is 33, meaning that half the population is older, half the population is younger. So your relationship with Brazil is longer than millions of Brazilians have been alive. I mean, millions and millions. It's a young, country on the whole still. But I'd like to ask you to put your historian hat on and to think about this moment for Brazil on the world stage. And when I say historicize, I mean either the past 5, 10 years, but really even the past sort of 200. How do we think about this moment for Brazil historically in the hemisphere and beyond? How do you analyze where Brazil is today?
So since 1500, when the first Portuguese landed on the coast and had contacts with the indigenous population and wrote reports back to the King of Portugal, there has been a constant theme of a country of immense wealth, possibilities, material possibilities, cultural possibilities. And this has been a constant theme. And there's a very strong sense among Brazilians that they've learned over the course of almost 100 years, if not 200 years, about the greatness of their country and the way they're proud of that. And that's been reflected in more recent years, in the last 60 to 70 years, in a foreign policy which really intended to promote Brazil as a global player, as an important member of the international community, with an understanding which was nonpartisan to a certain extent, in the sense that the right and then the left and then the military regime all shared, to a certain extent, a common notion of Brazil's grandeur, its greatness, or its potential for greatness, and have tried to carry out a foreign policy in that regard. And so in 1961, Jânio Quadros reinforced what had been a certain policy of Getúlio Vargas during World War II or before World War II, of somewhat a neutral, non-taking sides. The Brazilian government did enter World War II on the side of the Allies against fascism, but a notion of the need for Brazil to establish a certain amount of autonomy and independence and develop an independent foreign policy that would meet its own national needs as it built alliances internationally. And because of the influence of the United States, it was an important player in this regard. And so there was a lot of influence, there still is a lot of influence of the United States on Brazilian society, but a desire by the Brazilian government of all kinds to retain a certain amount of autonomy and independence. And I think that's reflected in many initiatives of the current government and past governments to try to play an important role in achieving peace and equality among the nations, an aspiration of Brazil to be a permanent member of the Security Council, rethinking of the way in which the United Nations was constructed in the immediate post-World War II era, making sure that Brazil plays a more important role internationally. And it's something that I think one of the goals that we have in the Washington Brazil office is to try to help policymakers in the United States understand this as a very deeply felt idea in Brazil that needs to be acknowledged and respected, and not assume that just because the United States has a specific policy that immediately Brazil will follow it. And I think this is an important thing to be mentioned. And I think the current government is trying to forge that independent foreign policy, as have previous governments.
Yeah, I mean, a related question. It strikes me that the WBO, part of what it's trying to do is to communicate to those in power in the United States and other actors in the United States a more, I suppose, textured understanding of Brazilian society and politics and the ways that society influences politics. What are some things in your experience on going in both directions that most Americans in the United States sort of misunderstand or get wrong about Brazil, and vice versa? What are some things that you've noticed over years and decades that are just not quite right that each country thinks about the other?
So one of the things we did as the Washington Brazil office in 2021, right after Biden was elected, was to write a policy paper to the Biden administration suggesting the challenges that Brazil faces and how the United States could play a positive role as opposed to a negative role in that. And we are currently finishing this year's version of the policy paper, which we hope to get out very soon to our members and supporters and people interested about this. It will be sent to members of Congress and to the Biden administration, circulated in Brazil in a Portuguese language version. It's all very important for our work. I think over the years, the most important thing is to really make sure that U.S. foreign policymakers, congressional representatives, really respect and acknowledge the importance of Brazil as an international entity, as an international body, a country of tremendous size and wealth and potential and population that needs to be truly respected and not treated as some auxiliary to the United States or some country that will automatically, unconditionally back every single policy position of any government in the United States. On the side of Brazilians in the government who support the current government, I think sometimes the pains and the sorrows of the past understandably filter the present, and sometimes people are unable to distinguish between different changes and shifts. I don't think anyone in Brazil would argue that there's a tremendous difference between what was the Bolsonaro government and what is the current government. Right. The current government of Lula is a broad coalition built with many different allies and people who have been previously not very friendly to the PT. And it's trying to work with a very conservative Congress to pass legislation which will try to carry out a progressive agenda. It's a tremendous challenge. The United States has the same problem because we're a polarized country with an incredibly conservative Republican Party supporting an amazingly reactionary politician under 92 federal indictments for crimes he's committed. And I assume he's going to be convicted of some of them, and yet still his supporters think he should be elected president, which is something actually Brazilians don't understand. How can he even be a candidate for president with 92 indictments against him? And I have to explain that in the United States, there's only two requirements to be president: 35 years old and be a citizen born in the United States. And so you can run for office from jail and you can be elected from prison, and then we'll have to figure out how that works in real life. So I think that there's a whole a simplification of the complexities of U.S. politics and society that merits much more information and dialogue and conversation. I remember talking to a person recently last year when I was in Brazil for the year about the importance of abortion rights in the United States. And the person said, really? Is that really an issue? Because in Brazil, the women's movement and people who support the right for women to have control over their bodies have not managed up till now to get even progressive parts of Brazilian society to support the right for women to have an abortion. Whereas in the United States, for years now, it's been a part of the platform of the Democratic Party, an important issue for many people. And we see was a very important outcome in the congressional elections that happened. There was a sweeping, and in recent votes, the way in which the right for women to have access to abortions has become a really important person that could be determinant in the elections of 2024. So kind of not understanding the subtleties and the complexities of U.S. politics and the way it works, I think is to the detriment of those who wish to understand the United States and actually even develop policies related to the United States. And so I think this is a process of dialogue and conversation and an interpretation that I think is something that has to go both ways, and we're trying to encourage that.
I want to agree with something you said earlier. One area, not to get into the entire Biden foreign policy, but one area I think the Biden administration has recognized that complexity precisely is that when there have been disagreements with the Lula government about foreign policy decisions, say Ukraine especially, they have not done what previous governments might have done in the last century, which is to say, you are not aligning with the United States. You are an enemy or you were on the naughty list. They have continued to find ways where they can work together. So we saw at the last UN General Assembly, for example, this labor initiative, the United States and Brazil, this bilateral, engagement. So I find that to be encouraging, that there isn't this knee-jerk reaction when Brazil has disagreed. They seem to be committed, I think, to finding areas where they do agree. And that's, I think, a better way of approaching the relationship. Where can we agree as opposed to bad Lula, break the relationship?
No, and that's really crucial for what might happen in 2024 if Trump is elected, because he clearly is going to immediately say that Brazil is a communist country and Lula is a radical, as he calls Biden a communist and a socialist. I mean, it's just the most insane accusations he makes, and clearly because of the way in which the Trump family has connections to the Bolsonaro family, the kind of alliances that will be built, the Steve Bannon connections that are very deep with the Bolsonaro sons, the possibility of really building an alliance between a government in power in the United States and a government out of power, wishing to come back to power. The Lula government has tremendous challenges to be able to successfully carry out its program and to win support. The last election was very close. It was only a difference of 2 million people voting that Lula won the election. And so I think the stance of the Biden administration has been, I think, in general, and I don't follow all the details of every single pronouncement made by every single member of his administration, but I think they've been cautious and careful and understanding the importance. And I think this is reflected in an unconditional support for democracy into 2022, when every single poll said that Lula was going to win. And so the Biden administration took a clear position saying, we're going to support democracy, we're going to support the elections, we're going to recognize the outcomes of the elections, we're going to denounce the attack on January 8th, knowing that who won the election or who was going to win the election was a center-left government, which they could have perhaps considered hostile to some geopolitical interests of the United States, because there are differences between the two countries on many questions. And yet they didn't do that. And they were very consistent about that. And I think, historians will really give us the last word on this, but I think from what we know already, the role that people played to pressure the armed forces to not intervene was essential for the existence of the Lula government, because it could have turned it another way. And because Bolsonaro had mass support, it could have been mobilized. And it could have been mobilized to really challenge the government and really provoke a civil war in a way that would have been horrendous for the country. And we averted that. And partially that was averted because, mostly because of the efforts of people in Brazil, obviously, but the international pressure on the armed forces, in my mind, was determinant in their backing off and realizing that this would be a fatal blow to them if they misstepped and supported a coup that was unsuccessful because it didn't get U.S. and international support. And so in this regard, all the ways that people might wish to criticize the Biden administration, and I was not enthusiastic about his candidacy when it was launched in 2019. Nevertheless, I think overall the policies have been moderate and considerate towards vis-a-vis Brazil, and I hope they continue to be that.
The last, I would say, decade or so, Jim, have been really, I think, instructive in a lot of ways. One of them, as we mentioned, is the importance of who is in the White House, right? When things are happening in Brazil and elsewhere, it really matters who is there. Another was, for a generation that did not really experience the Cold War. I was born, the year the Cold War ended, essentially. The past 10 years in Brazil was, we saw this real sense of anti-communism in a way that I was, we were there in Brazil several points in the past decade. And this sense that, this is what it must have felt like in the run up to 64, that if someone is a mildly left of center, they're a communist and they're going to do all these horrible things. And it seems to me that we're hopefully out of a really dark, I think, period in which this really hostile reaction to anything mildly progressive seems to have broken. That fever, I hope, seems to have passed. So I'm curious if you're feeling, as a lot of things come to a close, right? Your time at Brown, the year, this episode shortly, are you feeling positive about where things stand, encouraged, or are there too much to be nervous about?
No, I'm by personality and by birth, I think I'm a very positive person. I
You
learned that
are,
from my
yes.
mother, and full of energy and full of let's come out of this situation and build something out of it. So there's no question about that. However, I am not positive about the world situation. I think that the forces of fascism, and I use that word very cautiously, authoritarianism, the ways in which countries around the world are carrying out policies are very alarming. And the rise of the far right in Europe, in Argentina, the threat of the far right in Brazil, the threat of the far right in the United States causes tremendous concern. And so, in a way, I would love my retirement to be a moment of, relaxing and writing books and enjoying museums and going out to restaurants. It's actually going to, by obligation, because of my commitment since a young person, to really keep up the fight, because we're really in a global moment of tremendous polarization in which, Trump can get away with calling members of the Democratic Party communists, which is just crazy. But he does that, and his supporters support him. Or Bolsonaro can say the same thing about the moderate policies of, in many cases, of the Lula administration. And so, unfortunately, that we're not out of the woods. This is a very, very serious, polarized time. I can imagine a scenario which is very negative internationally, and which is one of the reasons why, in spite of all the demands it makes on me, it's really important to support the work that we're trying to do as one organization among many fighting for democracy and social justice and equality. And that has been my lifelong mission. I think that's the way I was raised, and it shaped my early life, and it shaped my academic career, and it's going to shape my post-academic career as I continue to work with the WBO and other progressive forces in the United States and in Brazil to work for that kind of world that we want to have. Another world is possible, but it's really threatened at this point by very nefarious forces in the world. And so I guess the message that we wanted to send out to our listeners today, and the reason we kind of wanted to turn tables and have you interview me, and I thank you very much for the interview, was precisely to emphasize to the people who listen to our podcast, the people who support the WBO, that our work is extremely important, that it merits financial support, it merits political support, it merits setting the word out to other people about our work, so that we can continue this really important work of being an important vehicle for Brazilian social movements to articulate their demands and concerns, and to educate the U.S. public and policymakers about the situation in Brazil, so the U.S. government and Congress can have a smart policy towards Brazil that will advance democracy and social justice in Brazil and will strengthen democracy and social justice in the United States.
Well, Jim, I always feel energized when I speak with you. Of course, how influential you've been in my life as my doctoral advisor, but really the amount of work that you put into all the things that you do, academic work, activist work. The WBO, I think, is a product in many ways of this insight that you, of course, with many others, but that you had for the need of an organization like that. So it's been, of course, a pleasure to talk with you about where things stand as the year draws to a close. And of course, I'm right there with you in pushing the work forward and doing my small part in this larger effort.
Thank you, Andre. And I should emphasize two things. First of all, the effort is extremely collective. I'm merely one person in a very important group of people working together. We have an amazing core team of 10 people. We have a board of directors that is 15 fabulous scholars and people connected to some important NGOs in the United States. We have 18 amazing research fellows working with us. And then we have, I think, 2,000 or so, or 3,000 or so people who subscribe to our free weekly bulletin, which you write the editorial for every week and do a brilliant job of that. And so I think we really have a large group of people who are really committed to this project. And what we want to do is to make it even larger, spread the word to more people so that it can strengthen our work and make it go forward. So, Andre, I want to thank you for interviewing me today on Brazil Unfiltered. This was
really my pleasure.
It was really kind of a switch of roles that I thought was a smart way to kind of end the year as we think about what happened and we talk about what our plans are for the future. Thank you so much for being with us.
I enjoyed it so much, Jim. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.